Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here with you today. Unlike the mayor, I had no idea this organization existed. So when I got the call, did a little research, I got even more excited about being a part of your event this morning. But I want to jump on the Jana bandwagon as well. I've had a chance to speak to groups like this, as many of you know, a few times, and I've never been treated with the hospitality and professionalism that I was treated in coming to this event today. So kudos again to Jan and her team. This is very impressive. You guys have a lot to be proud of. I know we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to condense some of my stories a little bit here. But I'm the business guy that had a chance to spend time inside of state government. And so I bring to you some unique perspectives, a lot of opinions, but I'm going to bring to you today a handful of stories that I've become very passionate about because I think these are things we need to be moving to the forefront of the conversation. And I too like the title of the event today. Beyond the Boom is it encapsulates so many things what we should be talking about. But when I left, oh, there's my screen. When I left Commerce, somebody asked me a really interesting question that made me stop and think. They said, Jeff, can you put in one sentence what Idaho needs to move forward? And I thought about it for a second, and I said, you know what, I can actually do better than that. I can put it into two words, talent and capital. And it's those two things I want to talk about today. And I go back to the video that we started our morning with. I mean, skilled workforce, all these things we're talking about, infrastructure, how we pay for it, those are the things that have been on my mind since I've left the state. And seeing the inner workings, I bring to you some ideas today on how I think this group and your peers can actually make a difference. But before I start, I want to just plant one seed. It's a timeless business principle, and many of you understand how important this is. Any organization that is successful in business has figured out how to focus their resources on the highest return. McKinsey & Study did a really interesting analysis a few years ago where they studied companies that did what they call dynamic resource allocation. All that is a fancy consulting term for companies that had the courage and the discipline to move resources and have them focused on the things that produce the highest rate of return. They outperformed their peers several layers. I would propose to you that that's the conversation we need to be having in our state. And I want to give it a quick call out to Tommy. This is one of the reasons I was so supportive of his run for governor, because he got it. And this is one of the areas he fully understood. We don't ask the question in our state and our policy, where's the highest rate of return? As a cabinet member, I used to yearn for the opportunity to debate with my peers to justify why my spending should be more important than theirs, because mine produced a higher rate of return. Never got the chance. Anyway, but I plant that seed because it'll permeate some of the things I want to share with you today. Let's talk about talent. Thank goodness we're finally talking about it as a state, right? Governor's task force, investing in education is finally a priority for our state, and we've needed that for a long, long time. Here's my biggest fear. Having watched that conversation unfold, I worry that we're going to become complacent and say, that's enough. We just need to keep spending more money in education because it's going to take care of itself. Here's the problem. The current strategy we're using, the returns on that investment are 20 years away. And I propose to you that there are some things that we could be doing right now that would make a difference today or in the short run. And some of you have heard me talk about these things. I would propose to you that there's two themes that we need to take from the dark recesses of the conversation, pull them forward and put them on the front lines and have these conversations. Accelerated pathways to skills and talent pipelines. And I'm going to talk about each one of these here for just a second. About 6 years ago, as I stood and looked at the landscape, and I did what Clayton Christensen, the father of the disruptive technology, Harvard business professor, I was always paying attention to the fringes and the periphery to see where some of the disruptive ideas were coming from. And when my own alma mater, Ernst & Young, announced that they were no longer going to use degrees as a primary filter for their hiring process, I started to pay attention. As few others started to adopt that same philosophy. And I started to think, wait a minute, our economy is moving so fast, there will be a time when businesses really don't care about degrees anymore. All they're going to care about is the skills that someone can bring to the table and what can they do. So I started talking about this, and I carried this very slide around the state. You could always pick out the educators in the room. Anytime I clipped to this slide, you could just see them seize up. And some of you just be fire burning in from their eyes, and they're just digging in, ready to have this debate. Because how dare I have the audacity to suggest that someone shouldn't have a degree? My vindication came last year when the CEO of LinkedIn used that very phrase to announce that LinkedIn was no longer going to use degrees as a primary filter in their hiring process. He went on to say something very significant. He said, resumes as we currently know them are about to dramatically change. Think about that for a second. Here's the CEO of the leading organization on the forefront of connecting professionals, giving us a little bit of insight into where the world is going. I would propose to you that we ought to be talking about this part in our life, in our policy, in our strategies. I'm going to leave it at that. I want to talk more about talent pipelines. Some of you have seen me show this before. I came home one night, October of 15, and this was sitting on the counter. I love this magazine, but I love this title. I love this cover. The New Rules of Competition, right? I love these. Be paranoid, disrupt yourself, but it's the third one that caught my attention. Go to war for talent. 1997, McKinsey & Company did a study where they identified companies that were being successful were actually treating their talent recruiting as if they were at war. They coined that phrase in 2001 in a book called The War for Talent. 2001, was that 17, 18 years ago? I would propose to you, ladies and gentlemen, that our state is at war for talent. And this is where my stories begin. We all are faced with finding good people, all right? I mean, that you could tell that conversation is permeating this group and your daily business lives. So we have that layer of this war for talent. Here's where it gets interesting. A year ago, over the holidays, I had a chance to go to Utah. And I got introduced to a gentleman who's a leading he's a leader in the technology sector down there, and he also happens to be a legislator. And I was fresh out of commerce. You can imagine that conversation. I was just peppering him with questions. And in that conversation, he shared with me that their tech sector is growing at 7% a year. Now, I stop and remind people that China consumed the entire globe's resources at 8% a year. So just calibrate against that for a second. If any of you have driven through Salt Lake, around the point of the mountain, into Utah County, into Provo, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's booming. And when he shared with me it was 7% a year, I had to absorb that for a second. But then I kind of chuckled and I said, I said the funny and kind of sad part about this conversation, I said, there's a number of state leaders in Idaho that are firmly convinced the reason you guys have that kind of growth is your tax rates are so low. Ladies and gentlemen, he laughed. He said, no. He said, let me tell you what we did, or one of the things that they did. He said, a few years ago, we set $20 million aside into a fund that rewarded higher ed institutions for producing computer science graduates. Think about that for a second. Performance-based, right? They didn't get the money until they produced the graduates. But this is a talent pipeline. They made a specific tactical investment in a known need in their economy. Ladies and gentlemen, he went on to tell me that because of that, they had a handful of universities step up to the plate to access that funding. They now have 4,000 students in their computer science talent pipeline statewide. 4,000 computer science students in Utah getting that degree. So I did a little checking. Guess how many we have? 650. Most of them are here in Boise. All right? So I was telling this story to a good friend of mine, Bert Glandon. And some of you know Bert. He's the president of CWI. And this is where this got even deeper for me. So I'm thinking about, okay, that's what one state did, and the results are pretty clear. But I start telling this story to Bert, and we were at dinner one night, and he kind of pushed himself back in his chair, and he looked at me, he said, Jeff, he said, this makes sense now. He says, one of my biggest challenges is keeping students enrolled to finish their time at CWI and to stay in Idaho. He says, one of my biggest competitors is the state of Utah. Now get this. He said, they're coming to my students and recruiting them to go to school in Utah with free room and board for the entire summer, so they accelerate the residency time frame. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at war for talent, not just on our own businesses, but with the entire nation. Now, this story continues. These stories happened before, but it all kind of fits together. And I'm going to lay this in front of you because I have some suggestions for you. Boise State, I'll say, has done a great job of taking a tiny fledgling little computer science department several years ago of about 25 graduates. They got some funding, got to 50. They got some more funding. They got to 100. They're now at 120, 130 graduates. They're doing a great job, right? So there was a point in time where I sat down with the head of the department after we just got the funding to go to 100. And we were congratulating him and we were talking to him about what his plan was. And he started so this is when I was still at Commerce. He started telling me about all the phone calls he was receiving from the tech companies in the Bay Area. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm Commerce. They should be calling me. I mean, that was going through, I didn't say that, but that was what was going through my mind. I'm like, what's going on? He said, well, they're calling me with one question. How many graduates do you have? Now think about this for a second. He answered, he said, well, we've gone from 25 to 50, 50 to 100, and they all congratulated him. He said, but the majority of them said one thing. When you get to 200, let us know, because then it'll be enough we'll care about. So I immediately asked him, well, what would it take to get to 200? And don't hold him to this number, don't hold me to this number, but he did a little back of the napkin in his head, and he thought for a minute, he said, $3 to $4 million. Pull back with me to 30,000 feet and think about this for a second. Right now, there's so much pressure in Seattle, Bay Area, a little bit in Portland. They're swimming in talent, right? But what do they have? Incredibly high living expenses. There are companies in those coastal cities looking for lower cost overflow areas to expand into so their employees can have a higher quality of life. But guess what? They're not going to come anywhere unless there's a source of talent that they can count on and grow around, right? Here's my point. $3 to $4 million is a rounding error in our state budgets. A rounding error. Imagine the tipping point that it could occur if we were to take $3 to $4 million, invest it in Boise State, help them get to 200 graduates, cross that tipping point. And the reason I share that with you is this group would enjoy this growth rate for another 10 years. There's no way to calculate the rate of return on that investment. It would be immeasurable. That's a talent pipeline. And here's what I would lay out at your feet. If each one of us or any one of us had that kind of a business opportunity with that kind of return, we would be doing everything in our power to come up with that amount of capital and get it deployed. And yet, guess what? Nobody's talking about this. I'm going to keep going. There is a dormant tool inside of state government that not only could help this situation, but it could help each of you and some of your talent needs. And it has one of those classic government titles. I used to tell them, you guys have got to change the name. Oh no, this is what we want it to be. It's called an industry sector grant, right? Let's put you to sleep. But this is one of the most elegant designs in the nation. This grant design essentially says that we will give up to $1 million to a higher ed institution who brings to us, being the state, a strategy or a solution that's industry designed, that has been designed with 3 or more industry partners, and those partners are putting in a 25% cash match. It's been used very effectively in a lot of different ways. For one reason, if you dangle money outside of academia, they have to care what you want. Now I realize it's a biased statement. I apologize to any educators in the room, but it's real. That money's dangled outside of education, and the only way they get is if they solve industry's needs in order to get them to write out a check. It's elegant in how it works. I had a chance to meet with the chairman of the Workforce Development Council the other day. Just happened to see him at a theater. And guess what he told me? He said, we can't place these. Guess what? Draftsmen, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, all of those are candidates for an industry sector grant. If this group became organized and reached out to CWI, Wayne Hammond's another person you could reach out to. There's money at your disposal that you could access to help solve your talent pipeline needs. I got to keep going. I'm going to grab some lightning rods, and I'm not having a conversation that's new to anybody in this room, but I'm bringing it forward because we have to talk about this. I would propose to you that it's mathematically impossible for our little state on our little tax base to ever think that we could pay for the infrastructure required to grow. What are the consistent themes? We go back to that video this morning. Talent, infrastructure. Now, if I'm wrong, you guys can just set this aside. But if I'm right, I'm going to leave you with a challenge today. But I start this by just reiterating that mathematical reality. We cannot expand if we can't attract outside capital to help us. I think everybody here knows that. I want to tell another story. I had the opportunity to go down to Utah with Senator Chuck Winder, and there was a small contingent of us that went down. And on the other end was a group of people that were hosting us that had been carefully put together. It was all of Utah's state leaders that had been involved in implementing the tools they now access to fuel their growth. And it was one of those moments where we got behind the door, closed the door, and they shared with us the real story of what happened. The backroom fights, the politics, all of the challenges they face in implementing the tools that they now are using. And it was so interesting. But Zions Bank, when we were down there, shared with us a study that they did. And they compared Utah and Idaho. This is 1 year analysis. The year that they studied, we brought in about $220 million for infrastructure. This is school bonds, sewer and water bonds, anything that went to infrastructure. If you don't know, Zions is one of the nation's leaders in municipal bonds and municipal financing. So they kind of know their stuff. Anyway, they did this analysis for us. That same year, Utah brought in $2 billion. That's 1 year's difference. 1 year. 1 year's difference. And you asked it, how did they do that? Here's where it gets challenging. Everybody here knows there's a handful of tools that they access to fuel their economy, right? Urban renewal is one of them. And some of you are in the audience today that were down there with us. And I'm not an expert on this, so if I butcher this, please forgive me. But when it comes to urban renewal, we have one statute, right? And I actually put a minus sign behind this because it's under attack every year. We fight to keep it on the books. They have 3. They figured out that they need one for brownfield, they need one for greenfield, and they need one for municipal buildings because each one has its own different governance structure and rules and how it should be deployed. It's brilliant, all right? They have local option taxing capabilities. But there's 2 others that are the mother lode. A revenue bond, for those who may not know, is, in my layman's terms, is that bond that doesn't pierce the veil of getting or attaching to the general assets of a municipality. So a sewer district, a water district, the collateral to the credit markets are limited to the revenue of that district, right? So there's no risk to the municipality behind the scenes on that bond. In Idaho, if I'm correct and I understand it right, we have to have a 51% voter approval to implement one of those bonds. In Utah, majority of county commissioners. Here's the mother lode. We all know this, and it hits the papers. There's editorials that'll pop up every time a school bond fails, right? We have that super majority. Guess what? We're one of 2 states in the nation that have this requirement, us and Kentucky. Now, I'm not a drinker, but I understand they make a good bourbon, okay? And I'm sure there's good people in Kentucky, but I would propose to you that's not an esteemed category we want to be a part of. If 48 other states have figured out a way to manage a lower bond approval threshold, we might want to pay attention. There might be some best practice thinking embedded in that would be worth looking at, right? Here's what's interesting, is if you dig a little deeper and look at how other states have handled this, they don't ask if we want to use debt. They have figured out how to use debt. And they put some really thoughtful boundaries around it. Don't let it, the city can't run out and just run up a credit card, so to speak. They have certain limitations. But we have had this wonderful honor of creating this huge wall that no one can get through. And capital on the outside can't get to us. Here's where, I'll stay on this slide a little bit. I had a chance to watch how it works. There's 105 leaders inside the state capitol. There's one that has had the courage to step forward and talk about local option taxing. Senator Chuck Winder. Now, I appreciate, yeah, he deserves some applause. I appreciate Tommy's last statement about how you don't want to give, giving money to politicians like giving, whiskey and car keys to a teenager. I'll just tell you, Senator Winder is someone that you might want to go sit down and talk to and grab your checkbook and go figure out how you can support him and anybody else who's on this, because that's the one glimmer of hope we have of tapping this list. Here's the challenge. There's nobody in the Capitol that's willing to touch those last two. Nobody. It's political suicide for anybody in that Capitol building to touch that issue. Trick question. How many AAA rated municipalities do we have in Idaho? A lot, right? Because we've protected ourselves from debt, right? 0. So this is where my CFO mind comes in. I'm thinking, wait a second. It's just that doesn't match, right? Because we've wrapped our flag in this conservative ideology that says we're not going to take on any debt, and yet we're strangling our economies. And when I learned this, I had a conversation with a handful of city leaders, and it turns out there's about a half a dozen cities, I think Boise's one of them, in Idaho, that if they could prove to the credit markets that they could borrow and use that debt judiciously, they'd actually get a AAA rating. Now there's the irony. What happens when you get a higher credit rating? Your costs come down. Your covenants get more flexible. Credit's is easier to access. And yet we've wrapped ourselves in this flag and we're so proud of it. Here's my point to this group. Someone's got to have this conversation. Because if we're growing at the rate we're growing and we can't find a way to pay for that growth, everyone in this room understands what the other end of that looks like. I'm standing before you as someone who saw the inner bellies of the giant. I saw what's happening and what's not happening. And as a business guy, my background's, I'm a turnaround CFO. My stint in government was fascinating, but it was temporary. I'm back in the private sector, but I'm bringing to you these stories to simply say, ladies and gentlemen, nobody in our state capitol is going to have this conversation. And here's my appeal to this group. What I do know is any time a business leader showed up at the Capitol, legislators fell over themselves to listen. Phones got set down, notes got set aside. Any time a business leader showed up at the Capitol with an opinion or with a story, they all listened. If you put yourself in their shoes, they're surrounded every day with lobbyists, with citizens. And there's nothing, that's the way democracy is supposed to work, right? But when a business leader showed up, they paid attention. Here's my point. This group and your peers have the ability to start having this conversation. And the day that your volume overrides the ordinary citizen's volume about, well, we don't want more taxes, we can't do this, that's not right. The day that balances to where you guys can say, wait a second, we can be thoughtful in how we do this so we don't have too many taxes, but we can't grow unless we can get capital. The day that's the word in the legislators' ears is the day that they'll step forward and they'll feel like they have a safety zone. A lot of people understand this inside the Capitol, but not one person is going to grab this lightning rod. This group can grab that lightning rod. And ladies and gentlemen, if I'm wrong, you can just set this aside. But if I have an element of truth in what I'm saying, I'm appealing to this group and every other group I can talk to. It's you and it's us together to raise the level of this conversation that can truly start making a difference. Because the cavalry is not coming. They're just not. No one wants to touch this. So with that, one final story. Brandon Bastide is the top guy inside of the Gallup Institute who's over workforce solutions nationally. He's a great guy. He loves Idaho. And Gallup did a really cool study a few years ago where they analyzed what truly drives academic success. And I won't talk about it today, but I highly encourage you to go look at it. It's just absolutely fascinating. It's not test scores, it's not class sizes, it's not GPAs, it's not the things that we measure in education. It's an amazing study. Brandon came and presented their findings to a group of us a few years ago. What I'll never forget is at the end of his remarks, gosh, I love this state. He made a comment. He said, Idaho could crush this. His point was, Idaho is small enough, and we have the ability to bring all the right people around the table, right? We know each other. We have the ability to get the right people at the table to have the conversation. His point was, if we want to, we could truly lead the nation and set a standard for innovation and creative thinking and solutions. I can't let that out of my mind. I firmly believe that with every fiber of my being, Idaho could crush this. We could lead if we wanted to. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm just here to share with you my experiences would tell me that this is the group and your peers and all of us collectively as business people are the ones that are going to have to lead this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I had no idea this organization existed, but I'm really impressed and I am truly honored to have been here today and to have had these few minutes with you. Let's figure out a way to change Idaho. Let's get ahead of this growth and let's own it. It's our opportunity, and there's no reason we shouldn't do it. Thank you.